Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your guest host today, Steve Francisco, and it's a pleasure to welcome back to our studio someone who I believe is one of our most frequent visitors, retired Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Paul Anderson. Yes. Welcome back to Access, Paul.
I'm pleased to be here. We aren't strangers to each other,
No, we're not. We've known each other for a long time.
And
but
we served together on Youth in Government.
Youth in Government, YMCA Youth in Government.
You were president of
was board chair,
Board chair, yes.
That was our first encounter, and we've had a good friendship over many years. But I kind of hesitate to use the term retired because, as I was saying just before the show began, it seems as if you're anything but retired. Minnesota's state capitol is undergoing a major renovation and restoration. Tell us a little bit about your activity with this project.
Okay, well, first of all, and anybody who's been at the Capitol understand it is one of the treasures of our country. It's one of 4 or 5 prime state capitals, built by Cass Gilbert. I mean, it's not the largest, but the way Gilbert built it, with the scale and the detail, whatever, it stands out. And so it is truly one of the best. But it was falling apart.
Mm-hmm. Literally falling apart. I mean, wasn't there a story in the news a few years ago about a chunk of concrete falling to the floor?
Falling down, they'd bring them into the House chamber to say that we need to do something. But we went through a period that the idea was you're not going to spend money on anything. And the Capitol suffered for that. But it was an interesting turn of events, actually. It was actually a Republican-dominated legislature, 2011, 2012, House and Senate. And now, knowing that Dayton would approve restoration, set up the Minnesota State Capitol Restoration Project. So despite what some people like to say in here, it is truly a bipartisan effort.
Mm-hmm. And how much money is this going to cost to restore the Capitol?
Well, that's a good question. You hear different figures. It cost originally to build, you can believe this, about $5 million. And even
in 1905
yeah, with the late 1890s to 1905, built by a conservative, anti-Franklin Roosevelt, later in his life, Republican, Cass Gilbert, but it had a cost overruns of double. It was estimated to be something in the low $2 million and built it for $5 million. But it's estimated somewhere around $275 million to restore it. I mean, there's just another thing going on. Is that does not include money for the restoration and protection of the artwork and the murals and the around the Capitol. So we're going to have to probably seek some additional funding. Not probably, you will if it's going to be restored. But I mean, we're not unique. Wyoming, that conservative state out there in the heartland of the prairie, they're remodeling their capital. They allocated $259. They're having cost overruns because they didn't estimate, so there's some additional costs. But like us, in Wyoming, they realized to do it right, they needed additional office space, so they have an addition to
Just
their
want to
state office building.
share with our viewers for a second. There was a story in MinPost recently about this project, and I found this interesting. The Capitol plays host to 201 state legislators, the Attorney General, the Governor, about 370 events a year, 13,000 tours, and 120,000 public visitors. I guess if any of us had that many people trooping through where we lived, it probably would show some wear on the building. So it's not surprising, I guess, that our Capitol needs a major overhaul.
But the good news is as it gets restored, based upon the plans of Cass Gilbert, it's going to even be used more. You know, you maybe heard that the senators, DFL senators, used to have offices in the Capitol. They're moved out. There's going to be a marvelous Cass Gilbert conference room library up on the 3rd floor where Senate offices used to be. Some conference rooms that are going to be available to the public. And one of the things that people don't know is the state auditor and the state Secretary of State used to be in the Capitol. They don't have it, but they entertain people in the Capitol.
Right.
So now they're going to have a space like the Cass Gilbert room where they can entertain.
So I guess one could say, when the restoration is completed, this building, the citadel of our state democracy, is actually going to be more accessible to the people than it has been up to now.
Because Cass Gilbert built that building. He referred to it as the people's place, the people's Capitol, people's building. He designed statements around by the legislature, the House and the Senate, to describe the legislative process, around the court, about the court process. He wanted people to come to that building, see how government worked, and to learn about it. And the good news is that the restoration should be able to fulfill that objective.
I want to ask you about something else related to the restoration project. There was a little bit of kerfuffle recently when Governor Dayton raised some questions about some of the artwork in the Capitol and whether we needed to have as many murals about Minnesota's pivotal role in the U.S. Civil War adorning the governor's reception room. But that actually led to a broader discussion that raised points from different minority groups about whether the artwork in the Capitol adequately represents who we are as Minnesotans. And just to talk, just for a second to elaborate on that, I'm not aware, for example, we have the largest Hmong population of any state in the United States. I don't know that there's any Hmong artwork in the Capitol that reflects that part of our citizenry. We've had Mexican Americans in Minnesota for a very long time, and yet I don't know that we have any statues or artwork that commemorates their contributions to our state. So what is the Restoration Commission doing in terms of perhaps looking at other kinds of artwork, in addition to restoring what's there, bringing in other artwork that reflects who we are as Minnesotans, the diversity of our state? Because Minnesota is a very different state now than it was when our capital was built.
Do you have a couple hours for me to tell you? No, I serve as co-chair with Senator David Senjum and Representative Diane Loeffler on the Capitol Art Committee, so I've been thinking a lot about this. And so, I mean, is that we got to think about what is the message that art should be, how should it be preserved. But let me go back to the governor's statement. I think the governor's doing exactly what a governor should do. Now, a lot of people got exercised over that statement. What the governor was doing by making that statement, he said, is that as we restore the Capitol, we need to think outside of the envelope. Think broadly. See, this building, the Capitol, was built as a memorial monument to our country's greatest generation. Now, Tom Brokaw will say that's World War II. No, it was built by the dying Civil War veterans and the veterans who had served in the Indian Uprising of 1862. So you have all kinds of things related to the Civil War. I sometimes think that there is not a major battle in the Civil War where a Minnesotan was involved that doesn't have a big picture there. And so, but that becomes historic. And so do you preserve it? But also, how do you deal with a couple of things? Much of that art was put in there at a time when the point of view of Colombia moving west and taking over the Indians were going to the Native Americans, were going to disappear as a people. They were savages, whatever. So there's a lot of art that's not only wrong, but it's kind of politically incorrect. But it's art, okay?
Right. I spoke to one person who is very concerned about this. He happens to be Native American. We had a discussion about this, and he said some of the portrayals in art in our state capital actually don't reflect how Native Americans would have been dressed, or in this case, undressed.
Yes. And let me give you a dilemma, though. Right behind the governor, every time the governor gives a press conference, is a painting that is based on a sketch by somebody who was at the when the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux was signed in 1851, a treaty by which the Dakota and Lakota gave up most of Minnesota south of Highway 94, and were confined to a reservation on the Minnesota River out west. Now, the picture has two governors in it. Sibley, who was maybe not providing what the treaty should have given to the Indians, and it was Governor Ramsey who signed an order to eradicate all the Indians from the state of Minnesota. So it's the governor's reception room, but it's maybe not quite like. But on the other hand, the painting is by Francis Millette, the artistic director of the 1893 World Exposition in Chicago, known as the White City. He invented the process of spray painting, and he was going to do the murals on the dome of the Kentucky Capitol, except he was last seen helping women and children get into lifeboats in April of 1912 as the Titanic as it went down.
Oh my
I mean, so it's historic in so many ways, and so what do you do with it? The committee is just forming. Its first meeting is going to be on Monday, by the way, but we're going to get public input, and we have...
Tell us real quickly, Paul, who's on the committee?
It's Senator Sengen, Loeffler. We have Dean Erdahl, who's very much immersed in Minnesota history, the uprising. Senator Ann Rest. We have Bill Green, who used to be the superintendent, and professor from Mankato, and Anton Troyer. Anton Troyer is the noted from the Troyer family. He writes a lot on Native American. I've got his Atlas of Native American History. The book is everything you want to know about Indians that you want to ask. And so we're trying to be sensitive. And one of the things about Troyer that will be interesting, he teaches up at Bemidji State University, and he works on projects, reconciliation of history. So it's not going to destroy history. We got to preserve it, but how do you reconcile it to the contemporary time? And the other thing is, we're going to have the state demographer come in and tell us what Minnesota was like in 1858, 1905, the centennial now, and what it's going to look like 50 years from now, because we have to look forward to make sure it reflects truly Minnesota history.
And if the Capitol is the center of our democracy, shouldn't there be artwork or some exhibits at some point that reflect that democracy in action? And I'm even talking about, art or photographs that maybe show protest.
Oh yeah. Now,
which is as American as apple pie.
The good thing about the committee that we're on, we're not going to get to the minutiae deciding what the
specific art.
We will decide what the theory of the art should be, what the message should be, what it convey, and then we'll be working on the spaces where the art would go. Big issue is going to be, do we have all the governor's portraits up there like they do now? I kind of like the portraits there.
I heard that even Governor Dayton actually suggested he wasn't sure he thought it was necessary to have all future governors' portraits in there. Maybe some of the Republicans would like to begin with eliminating his portrait.
I would disagree with the governor on that, whether we need all of the governor's pictures up there at the same time, whether we rotate. But this will be another thing. We're going to try and design some space so that there will be some rotating artwork.
That's what I want.
And I was recently at the nation's Capitol, and was going from the House office building to the Capitol, and along the wall were displays of art from each congressional district done by a student. I think we need to have some places where students do art. I go into the Republican Senate area, and I think it's Senator Hand has some paintings up there, drawings by some students from
From Eden Prairie, his district.
Now, very
right.
few people see this. They don't get back there. But we might have some place where students can, well, like, for example, we have competition at the state fair. And maybe after the fair closes, after its 12-day run or whatever, some of that art can go over to the Capitol for a half year.
Yeah.
So everything's on the table. But I'll loop back as I finish, is that I really did like, if you take the governor's statement in the proper context, he's asking us to think outside of the envelope.
And you agree,
I
obviously.
agree, and we're going to do that. So
Good.
He didn't say what to do. He just was put
Get
it down
you to
to
think
challenge.
about it.
The challenge.
And if all goes well, and right now it seems to be on schedule, that this will be finished and we'll have a completely restored Capitol by 2017.
Yes.
Is that correct?
We're discussing, see, they're going to open it up. It'll be used by the House and the Senate in 2017 in January, but all the work won't be done. So we're aiming towards a grand opening. I lean towards Statehood Day, May 11th. Wiser heads than mine who are involved in the legislature said, you don't want it to be the celebration. Let's aim for 4th of July of 2017. But we will celebrate the building. I'm going to go back to one thing. You know, I retired from the Supreme Court. It's a job that absorbed me, okay? When I finished the job, I had a little more time to think. I realized that I had neglected my own home. And I needed to put a new roof on because they were leaking. The windows are falling apart. And I want homeowners to think about it in that context, is if you don't take care of your home, and it wears out around you.
Yep.
And if you don't replace the roof, more damage will be done. If you don't replace the windows, more damage will be done. So it's just kind of like...
And more damage means more expensive.
Yes.
So sooner or later, we have to do this, and thank goodness the
or let
work
it
is
just
well underway.
Deteriorate to rubble. And so
don't wanna
we're
do
doing
that.
the right thing.
I want to switch gears with you because it's a real treat to have someone with your legal experience, many years on the bench, many years as a lawyer, somebody who thinks about the law, somebody who teaches law and has given guest lectures in other countries. I know you're going back to China this spring.
Looks like I'll be there in May again.
Right. But I want to ask you about some activity here in the United States in one of our state Supreme Courts. The state of Alabama Supreme Court recently issued a decision which was basically challenging the supremacy of the federal court system, as I read it. And it had to do with the issue about the issuance of marriage licenses to same-sex couples. Now, I think many people are aware there's been a conflict, even among the federal court jurisdictions, about whether or not same-sex marriage should be allowed. We in Minnesota don't have that issue because the voters took care of it, and the legislature passed
the
legislation
voters rejected
on it.
the amendment, which
referendum,
allowed the
right.
legislature to enact
But
legislation.
in Alabama, this court basically said, well, we're not going to listen to what a judge of a federal district court and the federal appeals courts were saying down there, and basically saying that the state of Alabama Supreme Court could put its interpretation of the U.S. Constitution above a federal judge. What's your reaction to something like this happening?
Okay, well, you have to go back a ways. First of all, it's a lot about Roy Moore, and I'll get into his...
Who's the Chief Justice
Chief
of
Justice.
Alabama.
He's the one who was the Ten Commandments judge and got removed and
Right.
then ran for election. And there's, I won't say hypocrisy with Justice Moore, but a lot of inconsistency with Justice Moore. It's like, you know, it's the whole term judicial activist. It really centers around whether you agree or disagree with what the decision was made. But let me take this issue back a little further, and just bear with me. But see, now that I'm off the court, I can say is that I'm never really a big fan about the jurisprudence included in the decision of Roe versus Wade, because the court decided that case too broadly. I agree with the bottom line with respect to rights to women, but they only had to decide it with respect to Texas and let the issue sort out among the states, because we're a federal republic.
Which Texas is where the plaintiff was from.
Yeah, and just
Right.
say, hey, that's Texas, it applies, let it sort out. Well, is it the Windsor case or the one that came out about...
U.S. versus Windsor a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
US
coming
Supreme
up on
Court,
3 years ago. Now, I thought this Supreme Court, divided court, made a very wise decision. they decided it narrowly. They said, okay, let the states decide what they want to do. And as if the states want to recognize same-sex marriage, then federal benefits follow. If they don't, then, well, benefits don't follow. Well, what's happened is states like Minnesota and others say, well, oh, these other states grant federal benefits and we don't. Are we going to? And so the issue was sorting out, as it should be, and the state legislature is being discussed, okay? Now, as it builds more momentum, it now becomes a matter of more equal protection. And so the issue arises now, if 3/4 of the people in the United States have this right, what about the rest? Do then states have the right to deny this
Right.
protection?
And that was the issue that was squarely presented this year already in oral arguments before the Supreme Court about, is there a federal constitutional right to same-sex marriage? And if the court says yes, we don't know what they're going to say,
Yeah.
but we expect a decision by the summer. If they say yes, that means that it's legal in all 50 states.
Yeah.
But back to this core issue, what do you think, though, when a state Supreme Court says basically that we're not going to recognize the supremacy of federal courts in interpreting not the Alabama Constitution, but the United States Constitution?
Well,
Are we in some trouble when state courts start going off
I mean,
that
we
way?
fought a war over that.
I
The
thought
Civil
so.
War. I mean, it goes all the way back to Georgia and the expulsion of the Cherokee tribe.
Right.
And when President Jackson said to the Supreme Court, John Marshall, well, Mr. Marshall's made a decision, let him enforce it. And then
Yeah.
you have the Trail of Tears. It's a tension on state rights. Many of us think that was resolved and decided at the end of the Civil War. Some people don't. It's not surprising that such a challenge should come out of a state like Alabama.
This has been an ongoing debate in American history, and I know many people feel very strongly about this, the argument of so-called states' rights. But the problem that I think a lot of us have, myself included, when you look at American history, a lot of these states did not protect the rights of their citizens. They routinely violated both their own state constitutions and federal law
That's the
in the
reason.
area of civil rights
So
and
that's
equal
the tension that
opportunity.
comes out between the federal constitution and the state constitution, because we are the federal republic, and this is really kind of fun, whatever, a state cannot deny any individual less rights than they are deemed to have under
Right.
the federal
We're
constitution.
not going to have two classes of
But
citizenship.
a state under a state constitution can grant more rights. And so what Alabama, Roy Moore's idea is we have a right to grant less rights than what the U.S. Constitution does. And no, good, bad, or indifferent, under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, we said that we are a federal republic and we have a national constitution.
Well, I think Abraham Lincoln and the people who fought the Civil War over this issue have been vindicated many times over.
Oh, yeah.
America could never have become the kind of country we became and the kind of world power that we became had it not been for this view of a nation and not 50 separate countries.
And that goes way back beyond. It goes. I'm doing the biography of Benjamin Franklin. He was probably the most fundamental founding father in this idea. You know that cartoon that has the snake divided into, it says either you join together or you die. And that's Franklin. I mean, the colonies had to come together, and so we have to stick together as a nation.
Yeah.
And that's part of what a civil society is.
I mean, we've even seen down in Texas this past year, actually had some people talking about secession. And again, back in American history, I thought the secession question was settled in 1861 to 1865.
It was.
But you have people, I think, probably more for local political purposes and dislike of the incumbent president, decide that they think this is okay to throw around these kinds of loaded terms.
This is what is so dangerous about politics in a way. I mean, it's very interesting is that they recently had an election in Israel, and Netanyahu made some statements about the Palestinian state. And, I mean, he doesn't even let the issue sit for a while, but he starts backtracking a bit after. I mean, we need more candor and honesty from our, But you know, you look at history, it's been that way for a long time. So,
You know, I think, speaking of Prime Minister Netanyahu, a lot of people, include President Obama and others here in the U.S., were very disturbed by the way he won his re-election recently, and some comments he made during the campaign about Arab-Israeli voters. A lot of people may not realize that, but there's a significant Arab population within the state of Israel that are
very
citizens who
significant.
vote.
see,
And
when
he
I
made some comment
yeah.
to the effect that, well, you know, my voters better get out, because if they don't, there are a lot of Arabs voting, and a lot of people found that very shocking and
Oh, well,
disturbing.
that's internal politics.
Yeah.
I won't get into. What I disagreed with and have a problem with is I thought he was kind of manipulating the United States by coming over here and speaking in the Congress. You know, the U.S. Ambassador used to be a American political person, and there are people that fell into that trap, and I think that in a way diminishes our standing in the world as a leader when we get manipulated in
Well, and the
such a way.
Speaker never consulted with the White House or
Yeah,
the
well,
State
that's
Department.
his deal. I just
Yeah.
say, I'm not going to get into
Yeah.
the personalities.
But who was it? There was a senator who famously said, was it William Vandenberg said, in terms of our foreign relations, politics should stop at the water's
Yes,
edge.
yeah.
And that obviously isn't happening these days, where you have Congress going off in very different directions, including denouncing potential agreements with Iran about its nuclear weapons activity before there's even an agreement.
Yeah,
Before
and see-
anybody's, I've never heard so many people denounce an agreement that hasn't been announced yet.
Well, it's a factor of the polarization, and you and I were talking about earlier. I said we were telling about what a good discussion we have when people, you know, they take the facts as they are and they come up with different conclusions. You know, engaging in discussion with those types of people is just so fascinating. Because you learn things. I mean, Abraham Lincoln once said, just because we disagree on something doesn't mean one of us is wrong. What I have a problem more and more with this polarization is people reach their opinion and then they pick their facts to support it. And it's so hard to enter into discussion with people that do that, because, you know, when you say, well, these are the facts, well, they don't care about it because they only pick and choose what supports their opinion. I've got relatives like that, and we just finally wind up just not talking about stuff.
Yeah. I've had a few too where we have to tread lightly. We try not to do it anymore at family holiday dinners. You know, we save the politics for another time. But but I think it's
But
fascinating.
I mean,
Tell us-
that's side, because it's too bad, because we survive as a nation because of the dialogue.
That's right, yeah.
And the differences in opinion that didn't
Oh, we have the discussions, we just don't do it over dinner now,
Okay.
so nobody throws a glass of wine at anybody else. 30 seconds left. Tell us real quickly about your teaching trip to China and about what you hope to accomplish
Well,
there.
there's a lot going on in China. Xi is reforming, trying to get rid of corruption, trying to reduce pollution, but he's also consolidating power. And it's a very autocratic country, not much rule of law there like we cherish here. But, you know, China has brought 300 million people out of poverty in the last 3 decades. So a lot happening, and I'm going to go there and witness it.
Paul Anderson, retired Justice, Minnesota Supreme Court. Thanks so much for being on our show today. Come back and see us again real soon.
Always a pleasure, sir. Take care.